Dust burst under Clay Mercer's boots, as he dropped to one knee beside the dying dog. Blood matted the animal's ribs. A rope burn scar still wrapped Clay's wrist from the winter cattle stampede that took his brother. The dog barely breathed. Left in the dirt beside the ranch road. Then wagon wheels groaned through the morning fog. A black carriage stopped. And the richest young widow in the valley stepped down. Men said her dog was worth more than some ranches. Clay Mercer lifted the trembling animal anyway, not knowing the choice had just changed his life forever. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Clay Mercer carried the dog through his ranch gate with slow, careful steps. The animal weighed almost nothing. Bones under torn hide, breath thin as frost. Clay laid the dog down in the dry patch beside the barn wall where the wind could not reach. The morning sun had barely climbed the ridge. The ranch still quiet. No cattle moving yet. No riders on the road. Clay knelt beside the animal. His rough hands worked gently. He cut the tangled rope still dragging from the dog's neck. The fibers were burned deep into the skin. Left too long. Left on purpose. Clay said nothing. Just dipped a rag into the water bucket. Pressed it against the wound. The dog flinched once. Then stilled. Clay's jaw tightened. He had seen cruelty before. But something about this one sat wrong in his chest. Hoofbeats reached the ranch road. Slow. Heavy wheels creaked behind them. Clay stood, one hand resting on the barn rail. A black carriage rolled through the open gate. Too fine for this stretch of prairie. Polished sides. Brass lanterns still shining from town dust. The driver pulled the horses to a stop. A woman stepped down. Young. Tall. Dressed in dark riding clothes trimmed with travel dust. Not delicate. Not uncertain. Her eyes found the dog instantly. Blue and sharp as winter sky. Clay watched her cross the yard. Boots steady on the dirt. She stopped beside the wounded animal. Kneeling without hesitation. The dog lifted its head weakly. Tail thumped once against the ground. Recognition. The woman's gloved hand touched the dog's neck. Careful. Familiar. Clay studied her. Fair skin beneath the sun. Dark hair pinned beneath a riding hat. Not a ranch wife. Not a drifter. Someone used to being listened to. You found him, she said softly. Clay gave a small nod. The woman looked over the wounds. Her expression hardened. Someone tried to kill him. Clay didn't answer. The rope burn across the dog's throat said enough. Wind moved through the barn boards. Loose hinges creaked above them. The woman rose slowly. Dust brushed from her gloves. I'm Eleanor Whitlock. The name sat heavy in the air. Clay knew it. Everyone in the valley knew it. Whitlock land stretched farther than most men could ride in a day. Cattle. Water rights. Money older than half the town. Clay glanced at the dog. Then back at her. He was dying on the road. Eleanor nodded once. Then looked across the quiet ranch. Broken fence rails. Weathered barn. A man trying to live far from people. You saved him, she said. Clay shifted his weight. That wasn't the plan. Silence settled again. The dog let out a weak breath. Eleanor Whitlock studied Clay Mercer with quiet calculation. Then her gaze moved back to the wounded animal. He won't survive the ride home, she said. Clay said nothing. Her next words came calm. Certain. So he stays here. Clay's eyes narrowed slightly. The wind lifted dust across the yard. And suddenly his quiet ranch no longer felt empty. The dog slept through most of the afternoon. Curled in a bed of old saddle blankets beside the barn wall. Breath shallow. But steady. Clay Mercer worked nearby without speaking. Fence posts first. The storm 2 nights back had knocked 3 loose along the south pasture. His hammer rose. Fell. Wood cracked tight again. The rhythm carried across the quiet ranch. Eleanor Whitlock watched from the shade of the barn door. Coat set aside. Sleeves rolled above her wrists. Not the kind of woman who simply stood and waited. She brought water from the pump. 2 buckets. One for the horse team tied near the gate. One set beside the dog. Clay noticed. Said nothing. Just kept working. The sun slid west across the pasture. Shadows lengthened. The dog stirred. A soft whine. Clay crossed the yard in 2 steps. Kneeling again. His hand checked the wound at the throat. Still angry red. But clean. Eleanor crouched opposite him. Close enough now to see the scars across Clay's knuckles. Old rope burns across the heel of his wrist. Not ranch work scars. Something rougher. Something sudden. The dog opened its eyes. Looked at her. Tail tapped the blanket once. Eleanor let out a breath. His name's Ranger. Clay nodded once. Ranger tried to lift his head. Failed. Clay slipped a hand beneath the dog's neck. Steady. Careful. Ranger drank slowly from the tin cup Eleanor held near his mouth. A few swallows. Enough. Clay lowered him back down. The dog slept again. Silence returned to the yard. Wind moved softly through the tall grass beyond the fence. Eleanor stood. Her gaze wandered the ranch. Weathered barn. Lean cabin near the cottonwoods. A place built by one man's hands. A place meant for quiet. You live alone out here, she said. Clay drove the hammer into the fence post again. The nail sank deep. Yes. No more than that. Eleanor studied him. The way he moved. Measured. Controlled. Like a man always listening for something behind him. Her eyes drifted to the barn wall. A rusted horseshoe hung beside the door. Below it, a weathered photograph nailed into the wood. 2 men. Younger. Standing beside a herd of cattle. Both smiling. The second man had Clay's face. But lighter. Younger. No scars. Eleanor stepped closer. Your brother? Clay's hammer stopped mid-air. Just for a moment. Then it fell again. Wood cracked. Yes. Another swing. The sound echoed across the empty pasture. Eleanor did not move away. What happened? Clay pulled the hammer free. Set it down. For a long time he just looked across the open land. The horizon stretched wide and pale under the evening sun. A place where sound carried far. Where mistakes stayed with you. Stampede, he said. One word. Flat. But heavy. Eleanor waited. Clay wiped dust from his hands. Eyes still on the distance. Winter storm rolled in fast. Wind pushed through the grass. Low and restless. Cattle broke the line. He paused. Jaw tightening slightly. My brother tried to turn them. Silence. Then the quiet finish. Didn't make it. Eleanor looked back at the photograph. The younger man frozen in that old smile. Alive forever in the paper. The ranch suddenly felt colder. Clay picked up the hammer again. Started walking toward the barn. Work unfinished. Always work. Eleanor followed with her eyes. You still blame yourself. Clay didn't answer. The barn door creaked open. Inside. The dog stirred again. Ranger whimpered softly. Clay crossed the shadows. Knelt beside him. His rough hand rested gently along the dog's ribs. Counting the slow breaths. Eleanor stepped inside the barn. The smell of hay and leather filled the dim space. Firelight from a small lantern glowed against the beams. Ranger shifted closer to Clay's knee. Trust already forming. Clay adjusted the blanket around the dog. Quiet. Careful. like a man who understood fragile things. Eleanor crouched beside them. "You didn't leave him on that road," she said. Clay's hand paused against the dog's fur. "No. You could have." He shrugged slightly. "Didn't." The lantern flickered. Soft gold light across the barn walls. Outside, a rider passed somewhere along the distant road. Hooves echoing faint across the prairie. Eleanor listened. Then her gaze returned to Clay. "You carry that storm with you," she said quietly. Clay didn't deny it. Didn't explain it. Just reached for another strip of clean cloth. Wrapped Ranger's wound again. Steady hands. Slow. The dog sighed under his touch. Eleanor watched the careful work. And something in her expression softened. Not pity. Recognition. Outside the barn, the wind shifted, carrying distant sounds from the valley road. Men riding. Too fast for travelers. Clay heard it. His head lifted slightly. Just once. Then he finished tying the bandage. The quiet ranch had held its peace for a long time. But peace on the frontier never lasted forever. Night settled slow over Clay Mercer's ranch. Cold came down off the ridge. Thin at first. Then sharp enough to slip through barn boards and under doors. Clay lit the lantern hanging from a peg beside the stall. Soft gold pushed back the dark. Not much. Just enough. Ranger lay on the folded blankets with his muzzle stretched across his paws. His breathing had deepened. Still weak. But no longer fading. Eleanor Whitlock knelt beside him with a small tin of salve open in her lap. The scent of pine resin and tallow mixed with hay and horse sweat. She worked the ointment gently along the raw rope burns. Ranger flinched once. Then stayed still. Clay stood at the rough table near the wall, slicing dried beef into small strips. He dropped them into a pan with warm broth from the stove in the tack room corner. Simple food. Careful food. The kind made for healing. Eleanor glanced up. "You keep broth on hand for strays?" Clay stirred the pan once. "For winter calves." A pause. Then, after a moment, "And fools that get themselves half killed." Eleanor's mouth almost turned into a smile. Almost. Outside, wind brushed the barn roof. Loose tin ticked softly overhead. The horses shifted in their stalls and settled again. Ranger raised his head at the smell of food. Clay carried the pan over and crouched. He set it down and kept one hand under the dog's chest while Ranger lapped weakly at the broth. Not greedy. Just desperate enough to keep going. Eleanor watched Clay's hand steady the bowl. Watched the care he tried so hard to hide inside silence. "He trusts you already," she said. Clay shrugged. "He's smart enough to know who fed him. He bit my stableman last month." Clay looked at her then. A short glance. "The first one that held. Maybe your stableman deserved it." That earned a small breath of laughter. Low. Surprised. It changed the air in the barn. Not much. But enough to be felt. Then came the knock. Hard. Wood on wood. 3 sharp blows at the open barn frame. Both of them looked up. A ranch hand stood outside in the dark. One of Eleanor's men. Young. Coat collar up against the cold. Hoarse breathing steam behind him. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat. "Your housekeeper sent me. Mr. Pritchard came by from town." Eleanor rose slowly. "What did he want?" The young man hesitated. "Tax notice came early." Silence settled heavy. Clay looked back to the dog. But his ears stayed on them. The rider shifted from one boot to the other. He said, "Mr. Briggs has been asking questions about your south pasture in the spring road." At that name, something cold moved through the barn that had nothing to do with the night air. Eleanor's face did not change. Only her shoulders drew straighter. "I'll return in the morning," she said. The rider glanced at Ranger. Then at Clay. "You may need to come tonight, ma'am." No. The word came quick. Certain. Ranger tried to stand at the sound of voices. Failed. Eleanor rested a hand lightly on his neck. He won't survive another move. The rider lowered his eyes. Yes, ma'am. He stepped back into the dark. Hoofbeats faded a few moments later. The barn grew quiet again. But not peaceful. Clay rose and crossed to the half-open door. He looked out over the yard. Moonlight silvered the broken fence line. Farther off, the empty road wound through the prairie like a pale scar. "Walter Briggs?" he asked without turning. Eleanor closed the salve tin. "Yes." Clay waited. She came to stand beside him. Not too close. Just within the circle of lantern glow. "He's been buying land around the valley for 2 years," she said. "When men won't sell, he finds other ways." Clay leaned one shoulder against the frame. "Lawyers. Bankers. A beat. Sheriffs who remember favors." Wind moved through the cottonwoods near the cabin. Dry leaves whispered against one another. Clay looked toward the dark south line of pasture. "Your ranch in trouble?" Eleanor folded her gloves in her hands. "It has been since my husband died." Her voice stayed level. But there was wear in it now. Not weakness. Just wait. The notices keep coming. Boundary disputes. Water questions. Grazing complaints. Always something. Clay nodded once. He knew that kind of pressure. Not by name maybe. But by feel. A hand at your throat that never quite squeezed hard enough to leave marks. Inside the barn, Ranger let out a strained whine. Clay turned back at once. The dog had tried to shift and caught his injured side wrong. Clay knelt and eased him flat again. Eleanor fetched fresh water before he asked. Set it near his hand. Their movements had begun to find each other now. Quietly. Without fuss. Clay dipped a cloth and pressed it along Ranger's ribs. The dog trembled. Then settled. Eleanor crouched on the other side. "He needs 3 weeks," she said softly. "Maybe 4. Clay kept his eyes on the dog. "He needs rest. He won't get it at my place." Clay looked up. Lantern light caught the tired truth in her face. Not fear. Calculation. A woman measuring risk and knowing exactly how little room remained. "My house is watched," she said. "By men who smile in town and count my fences from the road." Ranger's breathing rasped once. Then steadied under Clay's hand. Eleanor drew in a careful breath. "I'll pay for his keep." Clay's jaw tightened. "That's not what this is." "I know." She held his gaze. "No one takes charity kindly. Least of all men like you." The wind pressed colder through the doorway. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called. Lonely sound. Long and thin. Eleanor looked down at Ranger. Then back to Clay. 1 month, she said. Until he can stand, eat, and travel without falling apart. Clay said nothing. She continued anyway. "I'll send feed. Medicine. Whatever he needs. I won't interfere with your ranch, and when the month is done, I take him home." Clay rubbed a thumb once over the dog's fur. Thinking. Measuring. The barn around him no longer felt like his alone. Her coat on the peg. Her gloves on the table. Her presence in the lamplight. Warmth where there had only been routine. That might have been the greater danger. Outside, the wind rose harder. The barn doors shuddered. Ranger pressed weakly against Clay's knee. Clay exhaled through his nose. 1 month, he said. Eleanor nodded once. No smile. Just relief held with dignity. The agreement settled between them like a fresh stake in hard ground. Temporary. Necessary. And already stronger than either one wanted to admit. Morning came slow across the Mercer ranch. Cold still clung to the ground. Frost silvered the grass beyond the barn. Clay Mercer stepped out of the cabin with a tin pail in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. The sky was pale blue. Empty. quiet in the way only frontier mornings could be. Smoke drifted from the cabin chimney behind him. Someone had risen earlier than usual. Clay paused at the sight, then walked toward the barn. Inside, the lantern still burned low. Ranger lifted his head from the blanket nest. His tail tapped twice. Weak, but stronger than yesterday. Clay crouched beside him. Checked the bandage along the dog's throat. Clean. No swelling. Good. A wooden bowl already sat beside the blanket. Warm broth inside. Clay glanced toward the stall door. Eleanor Whitlock stood near the horses. Sleeves rolled again. Hair tied back in a loose knot. She held a brush and worked it along the flank of Clay's old bay gelding. Slow strokes. Careful. The horse leaned into it like it had known her for years. Clay set the pail down. "You're up early." Eleanor didn't stop brushing. Ranch habits. The brush moved again. Dust rising in soft clouds through the barn light. "I spent 10 years on my husband's spread," she added. Clay watched the horse's ears relax under her touch. Not the way a city woman handled livestock. She knew what she was doing. Ranger let out a small bark. Clay crouched and offered him a strip of soaked beef. The dog chewed slowly. Every bite a small victory. Outside, the sun edged over the ridge. Light poured through the barn doors. Gold against the old wood. Clay stood and grabbed his tools from the bench. Fence repairs waited. Always something breaking on a ranch. He headed for the south pasture. Boots crunching through frost. Behind him, Eleanor finished with the horse and followed out into the yard. Ranger limped after them. Slow. Determined. Clay stopped at the fence line. Hammer rose. Fell. The nail bit deep. Wood tightened. Eleanor picked up a loose rail beside him. Held it steady without being asked. Clay drove the second nail. The fence held firm again. Work passed between them like quiet conversation. No wasted words. Just rhythm. Post. Hammer. Rail. Dust warming under the growing sun. Ranger settled nearby in the grass, watching both of them with alert eyes. The ranch had begun to change. Not loudly, but in small ways. A second set of hands at the pump. 2 cups on the cabin table. Footsteps crossing the yard that didn't belong to Clay alone. By midday, the sun burned the frost away. Clay led the cattle to the north trough. The herd moved slow and calm through the gate. Eleanor stood on the rail watching them pass. "You run this place alone?" Clay nodded. "Since my brother." She looked across the rolling pasture. "Land wide enough for 2 men's work. Must keep you busy." "Busy enough." He lifted a salt block into the feeder. Dust clung to his shirt. Sweat darkened the collar. Eleanor climbed down from the fence. Picked up the empty bucket without being asked. Walked it back toward the pump. Clay watched her for a moment, then returned to the cattle. By afternoon, clouds drifted low over the valley. Wind picked up along the ridge. Clay worked beneath the lean-to sharpening tools. Steel against stone. Steady scraping sound. Eleanor sat on the porch step nearby. Ranger stretched at her feet. His ears flicked at every passing sound. Stronger now. More aware. Eleanor read from a small ledger she had brought from the carriage. Numbers. Land parcels. Quiet concentration in her eyes. Clay noticed the tension in her shoulders. "You expecting trouble?" he asked. She didn't look up right away. Trouble doesn't need an invitation. A rider passed far out on the valley road. Just a shadow moving through the grass. But Ranger saw him. The dog stood slowly. Tail stiff. A low growl in his chest. Clay followed the dog's gaze. The rider didn't stop. Didn't wave. Just kept moving. Watching. Eleanor closed the ledger. Her eyes stayed on the road. "Men from town ride past my land like that now," she said. "Counting fences." Clay wiped the blade clean on a rag. "Briggs." She nodded once. The name settled heavy between them. Ranger's growl faded as the rider disappeared over the rise. The wind picked up again. Dry grass whispering across the prairie. Clay leaned the sharpened tool against the wall. Then looked at Ranger standing stronger beside Eleanor's boot. The dog had chosen his place already. Between them, guarding both sides, the ranch no longer felt like a quiet hideaway. Not anymore. But as the sun dipped low and firelight warmed the cabin windows that evening, Clay Mercer realized something else had changed. For the first time since the storm that took his brother, the ranch didn't feel empty either. Wind rolled low across the Mercer ranch. Dry grass bent in slow waves across the valley. Morning light hung pale and thin. Clay Mercer leaned against the fence rail, watching the cattle drift toward the water trough. Quiet herd. Healthy, but restless. Ranger stood beside him. Stronger now. Still thin. But the dog's eyes had sharpened. Every sound caught his ears. Every movement held his attention. Clay noticed. A ranch dog again. Not a dying animal left on the road. Eleanor Whitlock walked out from the cabin carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. Steam curled into the cool air. She handed one to Clay. He accepted it with a small nod. Neither spoke. The prairie carried its own kind of silence. Wind. Grass. Distant crows. Eleanor leaned on the rail beside him. Her eyes moved across the valley road. Same direction Ranger had been watching. "You've got neighbors?" Clay shook his head once. "Not close." "Briggs land?" 3 miles east." Eleanor nodded slowly. She sipped the coffee. Then Ranger stiffened. Low growl in his chest. Clay followed the dog's gaze. Dust lifted along the far stretch of road. 2 riders. Moving slow. Not passing through. Watching. Clay took another drink of coffee. Set the cup down on the fence. "They've been riding by all week." Eleanor didn't look surprised. "They're measuring distance." "For what?" She finally turned to him. "For the next thing Walter Briggs plans to take." Clay watched the riders circle near the far cottonwoods. They never crossed the Mercer fence. But they didn't leave either. Just sat in their saddles like shadows. Counting land. Ranger barked once. Sharp. The riders turned their horses and drifted back down the road. Slow. Unbothered. Clay exhaled through his nose. "That's not friendly." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "It's patience." The morning moved on. Work called. Clay saddled the bay gelding and rode the south pasture line. Fence posts held firm. But the wire along the creek bed had been cut. Clean slice. Fresh. Clay crouched beside it. Studied the broken strand. Not storm damage. Not cattle. Knife work. Ranger sniffed the ground nearby. The dog's ears pinned back. Clay stood slowly. The valley felt different now. Less quiet. Less empty. By midday the wind had turned hot. Dust rose with every step across the yard. Eleanor worked beside the pump, filling buckets for the horses. Clay rode in and dismounted without a word. She noticed his face. What happened? He dropped the cut wire onto the porch rail. She studied it. One look was enough. They're pushing closer. Clay untied the saddle strap. Someone wants the cattle loose. Or the ranch empty. They stood there a moment. Wind rattling the cottonwoods behind the cabin. Then Ranger barked again. Harder this time. A wagon rolled up the ranch road. Town wagon. Paint peeling. The man driving it wore a stiff coat too clean for ranch work. He stopped at the gate. Climbed down slowly. Hat tilted low. Clay didn't move toward him. The man came anyway. boots crunching over dry dirt. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Clay Mercer?" Clay nodded once. The man handed him the paper. "County office." Then he tipped his hat politely to Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitlock." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She knew the type. Clerks. Messengers. Men paid to carry trouble that belonged to someone richer. Clay opened the paper. His eyes moved across the page. Quiet. Still. Eleanor stepped closer. "What is it?" Clay handed it to her. The notice was stamped red at the bottom. Land survey dispute. Boundary challenge. Claim filed by Walter Briggs. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Your north pasture." Clay looked toward the ridge where the cattle grazed. "My land's been here 20 years. The messenger shrugged lightly. "Mr. Briggs says otherwise." Ranger's growl deepened. The dog stepped closer to Clay's leg. "Protective now." The messenger glanced at the dog. Then back at Clay. "Sheriff will be out next week to mark the line." "And if he moves it?" Clay asked. The man smiled faintly. "Then the land moves with it." He tipped his hat again and walked back toward the wagon. Dust rose as the wheels turned. The road swallowed him quickly. Eleanor folded the paper once. Twice. The valley wind pulled at the edges. "He's not just watching," she said quietly. "He's tightening the rope." Clay looked out across the pasture again. Fence lines. Water troughs. Land he and his brother had worked with their own hands. Ranger stood beside him. Ears forward. Eyes sharp. The dog had nearly died on that road. Now he stood ready to fight. Clay rested a hand on the dog's neck. The quiet ranch had survived storms. Winter. Loss. But the threat now came from men. And men rarely stopped once they smelled weakness. The notice sat on the cabin table all night. Folded once. Then again. Red stamp still glaring through the creases like a wound that refused to close. Clay Mercer rose before dawn. Habit. The prairie still dark. Cold air crept through the cabin boards. Fire in the stove had burned low. Only red embers now. Clay poured water into the kettle and set it over the coals. Behind him, Ranger lifted his head from the rug beside the door. The dog's ears twitched. Alert even in sleep. Stronger each day. Clay stepped outside. The horizon had just begun to pale. Mist hung low across the pasture. A quiet morning. Too quiet. Clay walked the fence line again. The wire cut near the creek still lay coiled where he had left it. He crouched beside the break. Studied the ground. Boot prints. 2 men. Heavy steps. Not cowboys. Boot heels squared. Town boots. Ranger sniffed the dirt beside him. Low growl. Clay stood slowly. Followed the tracks along the fence. They didn't stop at the wire. They crossed the pasture. Straight toward the cottonwood stand near the ridge. Clay walked that direction. Slow. Eyes scanning the ground. Something caught the light near the trees. Metal. He bent and picked it up. A survey marker. Thin iron stake. Freshly driven. Red cloth tied around the top. Ranger barked once. Clay stared at the marker. Then across the land. The stake sat almost 20 yards inside his pasture. Not on the boundary. Inside. Someone had already moved the line. Back at the cabin, Eleanor Whitlock had the notice spread across the table. Maps beside it. Old ones. Yellowed edges. Her husband's survey records. She ran her finger across the faded lines. Measuring distances. Counting acres. Clay stepped through the door. He placed the iron stake on the table. It clattered against the wood. Eleanor looked up. "What's that?" Clay didn't answer. Just nodded toward the ridge. She understood immediately. Her eyes dropped to the map again. Slow. Careful. Then she stood. Show me. They rode out together. Clay on the bay gelding. Eleanor on a gray mare from the Whitlock stable. Ranger trotted behind them. Stronger now. Moving with purpose. The morning wind moved through the grass in long quiet waves. When they reached the cottonwoods, Clay pointed. Eleanor dismounted. Walked straight to the marker. Her gloved hand brushed the red cloth. Fresh dirt around the base. She studied the ground. Then turned back toward the ranch. Toward the cabin roof barely visible in the distance. "This isn't a survey," she said quietly. Clay crossed his arms. "No." She pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket. Another map. Smaller. Neater. Stamped with the Whitlock Ranch seal. Her husband's original water survey. She spread it across the saddle. Clay leaned closer. Eleanor traced a finger along the creek bed. "This water line feeds both our pastures," she said. Clay nodded. "That's why the fence runs there." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "That's why Briggs wants it." Clay frowned slightly. She pointed again. The spring. A small mark near the ridge. Almost invisible on the map. Clay looked up toward the cottonwoods. Water trickled quietly beneath the rocks nearby. He had always known the spring was there. Small. Reliable. Enough to water cattle through dry months. But nothing more. Eleanor's finger remained on the map. "If Briggs moves your fence line," she said softly, "the spring becomes his." Clay looked at the iron stake again. The land suddenly felt different beneath his boots. Not just pasture. Not just dirt. Water. Control. Power in a valley where summer drought could kill a ranch in one season. Ranger barked again. Clay turned. Two riders stood on the far rise. Watching. Same men as before. They didn't approach. Didn't wave. Just observed. Counting. Measuring. Eleanor folded the map carefully. "Now we know." Clay slid the iron stake from the ground. The dirt fell loose from the tip. "Know what?" Her eyes met his. "Why he's pushing." She climbed back into the saddle. Ranger circled the horse once before settling beside Clay. The wind carried distant thunder from somewhere beyond the hills. Storm coming. Or something worse. Clay looked toward the riders again. They turned their horses and rode away. But slowly. Like men certain they had already won. Clay weighed the iron stake in his hand. Then snapped the red cloth free. The small discovery had changed everything. This was never about land alone. It was about the spring. And now Clay Mercer knew exactly what Walter Briggs was trying to steal. The storm came in after sunset. Not fast. Not loud. Just a slow black wall swallowing the last of the light beyond the ridge. Clay Mercer finished barring the barn doors as the first wind hit. Cold. Sharp. Carrying dust and the smell of rain that had not fallen yet. Ranger paced the yard with his ears high. No limp now. No weakness left in him. He moved like a dog that remembered pain and had decided never to wear it again. Eleanor stood on the cabin porch, one hand on the post, watching the dark gather over the valley. The lamp behind her cast warm gold across the boards. A small circle of safety in a ranch that suddenly felt exposed on every side. Clay crossed the yard. "You should stay inside." She looked toward the south pasture. "Storm's not what worries me." Clay followed her gaze. Nothing visible now. Only dark grass bending under rising wind. But the quiet had changed. Too still beneath the noise. Too deliberate. Ranger stopped pacing. He stood stiff near the gate. Low growl rolling in his chest. Clay turned at once. A horse screamed from the barn. Then another. Clay was moving before the sound finished. He hit the barn doors hard and dragged one open. Inside, the gelding kicked against the stall wall. Eyes white. Foam at the bit. The other horse slammed backward against the planks. Clay saw it then. The water bucket overturned. The sharp bitter smell rising from the wet dirt beneath it. Not feed rot. Not mold. Something harsher. Poison. Eleanor reached the doorway behind him. Clay threw an arm out to stop her. Back. She saw the horses. Saw the foam. Her face went cold. Clay grabbed the clean barrel dipper and splashed fresh water across the floor, pushing the tainted puddle away from the stallboards. The horses kept fighting the halters. Ranger barked from outside. Wild. Urgent. Not at the barn. At the pasture. Clay spun and ran back into the yard. Wind hit him hard enough to steal his breath. Ranger was already sprinting for the north fence. Clay followed. Boots slamming through dirt. Rain starting now in cold hard spits. By the time he reached the rise, he heard it. The sound every rancher fears in the dark. Cattle running. Not drifting. Running blind. Clay topped the rise and saw shadows crashing through the storm. The north gate hung open. Wide. Lantern light flashed beyond it. 3 riders. Driving the herd hard toward the creek wash. A death run in this weather. Clay's jaw locked. He pulled the revolver from his belt and fired once into the air. The shot cracked through thunder. The lead rider wheeled his horse. For 1 second lightning split the sky. Clay saw his face. One of Briggs's men. The same narrow hat. The same dead eyes from the ridge. Then darkness swallowed him again. The riders pushed harder. Cattle bawled. Hooves pounded mud and rock. Ranger tore downslope, barking and snapping at the edges of the herd, trying to turn them. Clay ran for the gate, grabbing the cut rope hanging from the post. Someone had sliced it clean. Not storm damage. Work done by hand. He vaulted the broken rail and hit the herd from the flank, shouting now, voice rough and fierce in the rain. The cattle shifted. Some turned. Not enough. Then another figure rode in from the yard. Eleanor. Gray mare slick with rain. Hat gone. Hair whipped loose around her face. She drove straight into the open edge of the herd with a fence pole in her hand, striking the ground, turning the lead steers away from the wash. Clay looked at her only once. That was enough. They worked together without a word. Clay on one side. Eleanor on the other. Ranger darting between hooves like a streak of living fire. The herd bucked. Pressed. Then slowly bent back toward the pasture. One steer stumbled near the wash and vanished into the dark with a sickening crash. Gone. But the rest turned. Clay caught the gate chain and dragged it through the post ring with both hands. Mud to his knees. Rain in his eyes. He locked it shut just as the last of the cattle thundered past him. For a moment all he could hear was breathing. Horses. Dog. Man. Woman. The storm overhead. Eleanor pulled her mare alongside him. Water streamed down her face. "He's done waiting," she said. Clay looked toward the far ridge. No riders now. Only darkness. Only rain. But Briggs had made his move. Not paper this time. Not threats. Harm. Direct and deliberate. Back at the barn, one horse still shook but kept standing. The other had settled after Clay forced charcoal and clean water into its mouth. Maybe enough. Maybe not. The poisoned bucket sat in the corner like a piece of evidence no lawman would ever admit to seeing. Eleanor stood in the doorway, soaked through, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Ranger pressed against her leg. Guarding. Clay picked up the bucket. Set it hard on the work table. His silence felt different now. No longer retreat. No longer grief. Something harder. Eleanor watched him. "You can still walk away from this," she said quietly. Clay turned to her. Rain dripped from his brow. His light stubble dark with water. His face set like carved oak. He looked past her to the yard. To the cabin lamp fighting the storm. To Ranger. To the land his brother had died building. Then back to the woman Briggs had decided to break. "No," Clay said. Just that. One word. But it landed heavy. Because the peaceful life Walter Briggs had tried to destroy that night was no longer Clay Mercer's alone. By dawn the storm had broken. Rain still clung to the eaves. Mud covered the yard in dark shining tracks. Clay Mercer stood at the water trough washing poison from the bucket with sand and lye. Cold water ran over his hands. Over the old rope scars at his wrist. He scrubbed until the metal squealed. Not because the bucket mattered. Because rage needed work. Behind him, the ranch woke slowly. One horse stamped in the barn. The other still breathed hard but held its feet. Ranger moved between cabin and corral with his nose low to the ground, reading every scent the night had left behind. Eleanor came from the cabin carrying a folded blanket over one arm and the survey maps in the other. She had changed into dry clothes. Dark skirt. Plain shirt. No lace. No softness meant for town. She looked like a woman built to stand in weather and keep standing. Clay set the bucket down. "The horse?" "Still alive," she said. A pause. "Same as us." Clay nodded once. Ranger stopped near the gate and gave a low warning growl. Clay crossed the yard at once. Mud sucked at his boots. Near the broken post he crouched. Fingered the ground. 3 different hoof prints. One horse shod with a chipped left rear shoe. Same mark from the ridge. Same mark by the cut fence. He stood. Looked east toward Briggs Land. The valley lay washed clean by rain. Too clean. Like the night had tried to erase its own crime. Eleanor stepped beside him. "You know where they came from?" Clay's jaw tightened. "I know enough." He went to the barn without another word. When he came back, he carried his saddle over one shoulder and his rifle in the other hand. Not hurried. Not angry in a loud way. Something steadier. Something that had finished deciding. Eleanor saw it before he spoke. "You're going after Briggs." Clay set the saddle on the rail. "No." He checked the cinch strap for wear. "Then what are you doing?" "Making sure he doesn't come back easy." The words were quiet. But they changed the air. Clay saddled the bay gelding. Tightened straps. Checked the rifle chamber. Then he moves through the ranch like a man seeing every weakness for the first time. He repaired the north gate with chain instead of rope. He dragged the poisoned dirt from the barn and burned it in a pit beyond the windbreak. He stacked spare water barrels inside the corral. He positioned lantern hooks at both corners of the yard. Light where darkness had helped men do harm. Ranger followed him from task to task. No longer a guest dog. No longer half dead. A working partner now. At the fence line, Clay stopped and cut fresh willow switches. He planted them beside the creek crossing where soft mud kept tracks longest. A sign for watchers. A marker for himself. Anyone passing there again would leave a story behind. Eleanor watched from near the porch. At first silent, then she set the maps aside and joined him. She hauled boards from the lean-to. Fetched nails. Held posts steady. No instructions needed. By midday the ranch sounded different. Hammer blows. Saw strokes. The ring of chain against metal. Work with purpose. Work that answered fear with structure. Clay climbed to the barn loft and dropped down 2 old sacks of feed. He split them into smaller bags and stored them in the cabin pantry. Firewood next. He stacked twice what the porch usually held. Eleanor noticed. "You're preparing for a siege." Clay drove an axe into the chopping block and pulled it free again. "Preparing for men who don't quit." Wind moved across the pasture. Cooler now after the storm. Ranger barked toward the road. A single rider passed at a distance. Didn't turn in. Didn't wave. Just watched. Clay set the axe down. Watched back until the rider disappeared. When he turned, Eleanor was standing closer than before. Not near enough to touch. Near enough to be honest. "You don't have to do this for me," she said. Clay looked at the stacked wood. At the barn. At Ranger lying in the shade with one eye open. Then at her. "I'm not." She held his gaze. No flinch. No offense. "Then for what?" Clay was quiet a long moment. A crow called from the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the pasture, a calf bawled for its mother. Small sounds. Living sounds. The kind a ranch should keep. He looked out over the land his brother had worked. The fence they had raised together. The spring Briggs wanted. The dog left to die. The woman who had stepped into his silence and refused to leave things broken. "For what's mine," he said. The words landed plain. But Eleanor understood. Because his eyes had moved to her before he finished speaking. That afternoon he rode to town. Not to confront Briggs. Not yet. He went first to the blacksmith and waited until the man stepped from the forge. Clay said little. Just showed him the chipped hoof print drawn in mud on a scrapboard. The blacksmith studied it. Then nodded once. Named the ranch hand who rode a horse with that shoe. Briggs's foreman. From there Clay stopped at the feed store. Then the sheriff's office. He did not go inside. Just looked at the door. At the polished window. At the clean porch where law liked to sit while dirty work happened elsewhere. Then he turned away. By the time he rode home, sunset had turned the valley bronze. Eleanor stood by the gate waiting. Ranger beside her. The sight hit Clay in the chest harder than expected. A home should have someone at the gate. He had forgotten that. He dismounted and handed Eleanor a small canvas sack. Inside lay two things. A box of rifle cartridges. And a short-handled revolver, worn but well kept. Her eyes lifted to his. Clay's voice stayed low. "You know how to use it?" She gave the faintest hint of a smile. "My father had daughters, not fools." Clay nodded. "Good." He took the rifle from his saddle and leaned it beside the porch door. Then he looked over the yard. The new chains. The stacked wood. The guarded water. The lantern hooks ready for night. Ranger rose and pressed against his leg. Clay rested a hand on the dog's head. The ranch still carried storm damage. Still carried threat. But something stronger stood there now. Not just a grieving cowboy hiding from the world. A man who had chosen his ground. And chosen, at last, to defend it. The town gathered slow that morning. Dust rose under wagon wheels. Boots struck the boardwalk in steady rhythm. News had spread through the valley before sunrise. The sheriff would mark the new boundary. Walter Briggs would claim the spring. Men came to watch. Some curious. Some worried. Some already convinced the land had changed hands. Clay Mercer rode in from the west road. His bay gelding moved steady. Not fast. Not hesitant. Ranger ran beside the horse, lean and alert. Eleanor Whitlock rode a few paces behind. Gray mare calm under her. Her back straight. No sign of fear. The courthouse stood at the center of the square. White paint peeling. American flag hanging still in the warm air. Sheriff Dalton stood beside a survey table near the steps. Maps spread across the wood. Walter Briggs leaned there too. Tall. Heavy coat. Clean boots that had never stepped in real ranch mud. He smiled when Clay rode up. A wide slow smile that showed too many teeth. "Well now," Briggs said. "Looks like the valley's quiet man decided to come to town." Clay swung down from the saddle. Said nothing. Ranger sat beside his boot. Watching. Briggs dipped his hat slightly toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitlock." "Mr. Briggs." Her voice carried calm steel. Around them the townsfolk shifted closer. The blacksmith. Two ranchers from the North Valley. Even the storekeeper leaned out his door. Everyone knew something larger than a fence line was being decided. Sheriff Dalton cleared his throat. Survey shows the spring sits inside Briggs' land by 12 yards. He tapped the map. Boundary change stands unless someone proves otherwise. Clay stepped closer to the table. His eyes moved across the map once. Then he reached into his saddlebag. He placed the iron survey marker onto the wood. It clanged loud enough to draw every eye. Fresh dirt still clung to its base. Briggs' smile thinned. Sheriff Dalton frowned. "What's this?" Clay pointed toward the red cloth tied around the stake. "Found it inside my pasture." A murmur moved through the crowd. The sheriff picked up the marker. Examined the cloth. Then the hammered point. "That's a survey stake," he said. "Not one of mine," Clay replied. The sheriff looked toward Briggs. Briggs shrugged easily. "Could have been placed by any ranch hand." Clay reached back into the saddlebag again. This time he pulled out the small board. Mud still dried across the wood. The imprint of a horseshoe clearly pressed into it. One corner chipped. Distinct. The blacksmith stepped closer. He squinted once. Then nodded slowly. "That's Caleb Turner's horse. Briggs' foreman." The crowd stirred again. Sheriff Dalton's eyes moved from the hoofprint to Briggs. Briggs kept his voice smooth. "Lots of horses were iron." The blacksmith shook his head. "Not like that one." Silence fell heavy over the square. Then Ranger stood. Ears forward. Low growl rumbling in his chest. Clay rested a hand on the dog's head. Keeping him still, Eleanor stepped forward next. She unfolded the yellowed map across the table. Older paper. Stamped seal. Her husband's original water survey. Sheriff Dalton leaned over it. "You kept these records?" "My husband kept them," Eleanor said. "The spring was mapped before Walter Briggs bought his first acre in this valley." The sheriff traced the creek line with one finger. Measured the distance. Looked again at the iron marker. Then slowly folded Briggs' new survey map closed. Briggs' smile had disappeared. His jaw tightened. "You're taking the word of a widow and a drifter over a proper filing?" Clay didn't react. Just watched. The sheriff straightened. His voice carried across the square. "The boundary stands where it always has." A long breath left the watching crowd. Briggs stepped forward. Anger finally breaking through. "You'll regret that." Sheriff Dalton's hand rested lightly on the revolver at his belt. "You threaten this town again and you'll regret staying in it." For a moment no one moved. Dust drifted across the street. A wagon creaked somewhere behind the crowd. Then Briggs turned. His boots struck the boardwalk hard. He climbed into his carriage without another word. The driver snapped the reins. The wagon rolled away fast. Too fast. Clay watched it until it vanished down the road. The tension drained slowly from the square. Men began talking again. Low voices. Relieved ones. The blacksmith clapped Clay once on the shoulder. "Good work, son." Clay nodded slightly. Nothing more. Eleanor stood beside him. The morning sun warmed the town now. Bright. Clean. Sheriff Dalton rolled the maps together and handed the old survey back to her. "You hold on to that." "I will." Clay swung back onto his horse. Ranger leapt up beside the stirrup. Ready to run. As they turned toward the west road, Eleanor rode close beside him. "You didn't have to come to town," she said. Clay looked out toward the open prairie. The valley stretched wide and quiet again. "Yes," he said simply. "Because some fights had to be faced in the open. And Walter Briggs had just lost the one place he believed he could never lose. In front of everyone." Autumn came quiet to the Mercer ranch. The valley turned gold first. Then copper. Grass bowed under cool wind moving down from the high ridges. Clay Mercer stood at the fence line with a hammer resting across his shoulder. He watched the cattle drift slowly toward the creek. Healthy herd now. Calf strong. No more restless running in the night. Ranger moved along the pasture edge beside them. No limp. No weakness. Just a steady working dog with sharp eyes and a scar hidden beneath his fur. Clay noticed the way the herd followed the dog's path without fear. Animals remembered kindness and protection. Behind him the cabin door creaked open. Eleanor Whitlock stepped out carrying a small basket of tools. Sunlight caught in her hair. The wind lifted a loose strand across her cheek. She didn't brush it away. Just crossed the yard and set the basket beside the fence post. "You missed one nail," she said. Clay looked down. Sure enough. One rail loose near the corner. He drove the nail in with 2 firm strikes. The fence settled tight. Eleanor leaned against the post. The ranch looked different now. The gate chain strong. Lantern hooks still in place though the danger had passed. Water barrels stacked beside the barn. Precautions turned into habit. Clay wiped dust from his hands. Dogs ready. Eleanor followed his gaze. Ranger stood near the barn door now, watching them both. Tail moving slowly. The dog had been running full pasture for a week. The wounds long healed. Strong enough to ride back to the Whitlock ranch any day. Eleanor nodded once. "I know." But she didn't move. The wind carried the sound of the spring running through the cottonwoods. Clear water. Still theirs. Clay walked toward the barn. Ranger followed at once. The dog looked up as Clay knelt beside him. Hands resting briefly along the animal's ribs. Checking the strength there. Out of habit. Not worry. "He'll make the ride," Clay said. Eleanor stood near the barn door. Watching. "You're certain?" Clay nodded. Silence settled between them. The quiet kind that had grown familiar over the past month. Work shared. Meals eaten with few words. Storm repairs. Fence lines walked together. The ranch no longer echoed with emptiness. Eleanor stepped inside the barn. Her boots stirred dust across the floor. Ranger rose and walked to her. She knelt and wrapped both arms around the dog's neck. For a moment the strong young widow closed her eyes. Not weakness. Just farewell. Ranger licked her hand. Then glanced back toward Clay. Waiting. Always watching the man who had lifted him from death on the road. Clay stood. Looked toward the open barn doors. The pasture stretched wide beyond them. Sun warm. Wind gentle. Peaceful land again. "You could leave him here," Clay said. The words came low. Almost reluctant. Eleanor looked up slowly. Her eyes searched his face. "Could I?" Clay shrugged slightly. "He's decided where he belongs." Ranger wagged once, as if agreeing. Eleanor rose to her feet. She walked out into the sunlight. Clay followed. They stood beside the fence together. The valley lay quiet. Smoke drifted from the cabin chimney. Cattle grazed along the creek. Life. Simple. Earned. Eleanor rested both hands on the rail. "My husband used to say land tells you where home is," she said softly. Clay said nothing. Just listened. She looked toward the cabin. Then the barn. Then the dog sitting between them. "And sometimes," she added, "home answers back." The wind lifted across the pasture. Ranger trotted out toward the herd. Circling once before settling beside a young calf. Already guarding. Already working. Clay leaned his forearms on the fence rail. For a long time neither of them spoke. The past still lived here. In the barn. In the photograph nailed to the wall. In the empty place beside Clay's brother's saddle. But the ranch no longer felt like a graveyard of memories. Eleanor finally turned toward him. "I'll still ride out from time to time," she said. "To check on the spring." Clay nodded. "That's fair." Her smile came slow. "Someone has to make sure you don't miss another fence nail." Clay almost smiled back. Almost. Ranger barked once across the pasture. The cattle shifted calmly under the dog's watch. Evening light settled warm over the valley. Gold across the grass. Firelight beginning to glow in the cabin windows. Clay watched it all. The land. The dog. The woman beside him. The quiet future stretching forward where loneliness once lived. The ranch had survived storms. Men who tried to steal it. Loss that once felt permanent. And now something new had taken root here. Not loud. Not rushed. Just steady. Like the spring running beneath the cottonwoods. The kind of peace a man could finally build a life around. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.